All right, we're going to start with our last panel. It's a panel touching on issues of environmental sustainability and global governance. And we have our two last speakers of the day. We'll begin with Dr. Oonagh Fitzgerald. She's at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and she is the director of the International Law Research Program. And the program actually touches on three areas: international economic, environmental, and intellectual property law research. Our next speaker will be Professor Peter Stoett. He's the director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center, and he's a professor of political science at the University in Montreal, Concordia University. And he will be touching on issues of transnational crime, climate justice, and global governance. So I'll pass it off to Dr. Fitzgerald. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me? Is it loud enough? Oh, probably not. So let me turn it on. Hi. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Everyone, can you hear me? Does it sound all right? Okay, great. So I'm Oonagh, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I feel like Scotty at the controls, this big station. So, you know, if you need to be beamed up, just ask. So my title is there before you: Equality, Sustainability, and Solidarity, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, Rule of Law, Human Rights, and Sustainable Development Goals, all in about 25 minutes. So it'll be a light over for all of you. So this page was, you'll see I put pictures in my slides, mostly to keep me alert while I'm making the slides. So on this one, it's kind of personal why I put these together. This is because I think 2015 was a very interesting year. There were a number of developments on the international level that indicated a kind of maturity in the global community, where there's a lot more thought about, first of all, how you make international law, and how do you get different countries to work together. So this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk very briefly on global rule of law. Then I'm going to explain a little bit about the Paris Agreement to see some of these interesting developments. I'll talk a bit about human rights and climate change, and then turn to the Sustainable Development Goals, and finally conclude very quickly. So here you've got a picture. I had to throw that in. Thomas Piketty, I'm a great fan. The only reason he's there is because he's talking about money. And money is actually kind of important in all these issues. If you actually want to solve climate change, you really do need to deal with money as well. And capital is a big part of that. So, okay, global rule of law. And here you have two smiling faces from professors many of you will know, Jutta Brunet and Stephen Toop. They've written very interesting work on this idea of international law. And I think climate change is a wonderful example of that. So, as Canadians, we like the rule-based approach to international affairs, so we don't have to be at war with everybody. And the rules-based system has really helped globalization expand. But it is certainly clear that after several decades that it has raised many other governance challenges, and now we require new international, transnational, private international, and domestic law to address many of those issues thrown up by globalization. So Jutta and Stephen have written about how international law is often just something out there that nobody's actually following, and therefore it has this challenge of legitimacy. And that certainly has been the case with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change over the last decade and more, where people have really wondered, you know, what is that all about if nobody's complying at all? So they talk about this idea that to have a real law has to have an obligatory effect, and to generate that you have to have shared understandings, criteria of legality, and a practice of legality. And this will eventually create legitimacy and a sense of commitment. And there you have, in one sentence, that's sort of summing up what they've written about in a book and many articles. And please go read those, because it's much more sophisticated than I'm giving you here. So I guess the bottom line there is that really international law's legitimacy has to be earned. It's not enough just to write some nice things down. So the Paris Agreement on climate change is a really interesting example of international law, because it is, in fact, an agreement where all the nations participating in the UNFCCC process agreed to it, and they're all presumably going to sign on. Let's hope. We all cross our fingers. But it's a very soft piece of law. It's not soft law quite in the sense of being something that doesn't even claim to be law. It actually claims to be a binding agreement, but its language is quite soft. And that was the way they were able to get all the countries to sign on, because as you can imagine, China and the US, they're very concerned about their sovereignty, and they're not prepared to sign on to any treaty. And you may also know that Canada had signed on and ratified the Kyoto Protocol, but then withdrew because it was not able to comply with it. So, we already had an example of an unsuccessful, strongly worded treaty, and so I think people were a bit nervous and they wanted to make something soft. But that's not the only thing that's interesting about this treaty. I think what's really interesting is how we see this language of equity, solidarity, and sustainability. And it's a new, to me it seems like a new approach that's really coming out of the UN. We heard it, and I'll go into more detail on that later, with the Sustainable Development Goals when they were approved by the UN in September of last year. And that same attitude of equity, solidarity, and sustainability came forward in this Paris Agreement. And I suppose it was, the sort of emotional content of the meeting was no doubt reinforced by the horrible circumstances, 2 weeks earlier with the terrorist attack. So I think people really wanted to make Paris a success. Now, there was a big debate there about human rights. Everybody thought that human rights had to be in the convention, in the agreement, but I guess how it was going to be in the agreement was controversial. And in the end, it does not find its way into a specific provision that says one must comply with human rights. But one finds it is imbuing the entire agreement, in fact. So I've just put on the board there two of the most kind of outstanding provisions that you can see. And this is the preamble, okay? So it's the preamble. What does the preamble mean? But it's certainly setting a context. And so it's talking about how climate change is of common concern to all humankind, and that when taking any action to address climate change, parties should respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. So it's bringing in all the human rights obligations that the state parties already have. And look at the list of types of rights that are mentioned there. I just highlighted a few, but health, the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, that's unusual, gender equality and empowerment, and intergenerational equity. And then look at the next one, this other part of the preamble where it's sort of how you conceive of ecosystems, and it uses these wonderful language from different, different contexts, such as, first of all, protection of biodiversity, that's perhaps not so new, but then recognized by some cultures as Mother Earth, and noting the importance for some of the concept of climate justice. So we'll come to that later. So you can see it's really quite interesting language. There was disappointment that it was not, as I say, an operative provision of the convention, but still there's some very good language there. Now this provision I'm putting a fair emphasis on just because it really is the core of the climate change agreement. I think it sets the global goal. So instead of saying, Canada, you must do such and such, there's a global goal that everybody agreed to, and that's this idea of you have to keep global average temperature lower than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and make every effort to keep it below 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels. So everyone agreed to that. But look at all the surrounding language that comes in. First of all, there's this language of context, the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So whatever you do, you have to consider these things, these elements. We have to reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. In addressing the adverse effects, we have to foster climate resilience and in a manner that does not threaten food production, because obviously that's going to be important. And finally, making financial flows, back to my point about money, consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. So strongly saying, you've got to move money. That's the only way you're going to make progress here. And then finally, this agreement will be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of different national circumstances. So it's kind of, not one size fits all. Everybody, it depends on the country. Everyone's got to do their best efforts. That's the approach, as opposed to the approach that was in the earlier agreement, which was very much bifurcated between the developed world and the developing world. This is sort of everyone must try, but developed countries should really take a lead and try even harder and help developing countries. So very quickly, I've just set down there what all the main operative provisions are in the Paris Agreement, and there you see the Secretary General and the President of the COP, and Secretary General of the UN, and others all congratulating themselves for the agreement. If you want to read a critique of it, David Estrin, who's one of our senior fellows, he thought it was a very watered-down document from his point of view as, I guess, more of a domestic lawyer. Here I'm just showing you the broad outline. Each of these provisions has in it elements that relate to sharing expertise, sharing resources, respecting human rights. So, the Article 3, which talks about ambition to progress over time, it is all about showing leadership and helping other countries to make progress. That's, in fact, one way that a developed country can really advance its goals of addressing climate change. Periodic reporting is required. There's provisions on more conservation. Article 6 talks about voluntary cooperation. This is that idea that you almost form a partnership with other countries. So if a developing country would be in perhaps a partnership with a developed country to see how you can move expertise and capacity building from one country to the other to mutually support each other in addressing climate change. The loss and damage mechanism. This was a big win because everyone thought this was going to be thrown out entirely. And this is to deal with the overwhelming risks of loss and damage that climate change presents. So such things as islands being swallowed by rising oceans and massive storms, that sort of thing. So that is, at least the mechanism has been recognized in the agreement. There's still lots of work to do to actually create the mechanism. Article 9 talks a lot about financing, and really this is the heart of the agreement. And there's an issue here, and this gets back to my little picture of Piketty. The state parties have pledged $100 billion, but this is viewed as not sufficient money, and there is a great deal of desire to sort of get the private sector involved in addressing climate change, so having public-private partnerships. So the financing mechanism will have to find ways to leverage all that private capital to get it engaged in addressing these issues. The technology mechanism is all about finding clean technology and then finding ways to share that with other people in the world so that everyone can take advantage of it. Article 11 is about capacity building. Article 12 is really interesting. Public awareness is an important feature here, and public education. And then the transparency framework is basically how the compliance mechanism. It's very soft, it's flexible, non-punitive compliance mechanism, but the idea is really that by reporting on results of your commitments and discussing them, that the pressure will be put on countries to improve. And then there's a 5-year stock taking every 5 years. So more pictures. So here we have John Knox on the right. He is the special rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Long title for him. Mary Robinson, you probably have all seen before, and she's been an outspoken advocate for human rights, and also human rights in the context of climate change. So John Knox just issued a report this month, and he talks about his view that the Paris Agreement is significant because of recognizing that climate change poses unacceptable threats to the full enjoyment of human rights, and that actions to address climate change must comply with human rights obligations. And I'll give you one example of that, and we heard about this a lot at the Peru COP20. Because there's so much money flowing to address climate change, you see a lot of big projects happening. And so every time you do a big project, you have this risk that you're displacing people. And that has been a big issue, you know, where they displace whole populations to build a dam and say, oh, well, we're solving climate change, but they've actually created some major human rights violations. So the Human Rights Council has recognized that the worst effects of climate change are felt by those who are already vulnerable because of factors such as geography, poverty, gender, age, indigenous or minority status, national or social origin, birth or other status, and disability. And of course, who is more vulnerable but those who are not here yet, right? The next generation. So I have a picture here of Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who wrote this book. I don't know if you've read it, but The Right to be Cold, I recommend it to you. It's a very interesting autobiography of her advocacy for environmental improvements because of the problems that the people of the Arctic are feeling as a result of climate change and chemical pollutants. James Anaya, who is the special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, has stated that climate change has particular adverse effects on people such as the Sami, who depend upon Arctic climate for their livelihoods. So more from John Knox. He talks about he says that states have obligations to protect against the infringement of human rights by climate change, even if they're not really the cause of the climate change. So, and he also says that they have a duty of international cooperation. And this is a really interesting point, and I think it again, is one of those ideas that really pervades the Paris Agreement, the idea that you have to work with others. And now, John Knox bases it on very fundamental concepts. So he goes back to the Charter of the United Nations, Article 55, which requires the UN to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And then Article 56, which requires members to pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation to achieve those objectives. And then he also refers to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that was discussed this morning, where Article 2, Sub 1 talks about the need to provide international assistance and cooperation to help states to realize the goals that are in that convention. John Knox also, he talks about procedural obligations and substantive obligations. So on the procedural side, he says that the duties of states would include assessing environmental impacts, providing environmental information to people. So access to information, or actually putting out all that information in a proactive way rather than requiring people to ask for it. And he also, his other idea is that states must facilitate public participation in environmental decision making. And it's really interesting that there was this process to develop nationally determined commitments prior to COP21, which was in December of last year. So all states were trying to do that, and Canada did indeed submit some nationally determined commitments. But there was no public consultation on it. There was a very odd, there's a few newspaper articles about the communication between the provinces and the federal government, but there wasn't much in the way of, there was nothing in the way of public communication and discussion. And interestingly, I was talking to people at the Inter-American Development Bank, where they've been providing assistance to the Central American countries to do their nationally determined commitments. And in all of those examples, public participation was a key element. So I think next time Canada does its nationally determined commitments, let's hope there's going to be a lot of public participation. I think there will. And then finally, there has to be access to remedies. So those are procedural rights. And then substantively, states have to really create the legal framework that will allow the climate change action to take place. So they have to do that at the national level, and also at the international level, they need to cooperate with each other, as was mentioned, and they have to keep moving their current commitments beyond those to raise the ambition. That was an expression that was used a lot in Paris. John Knox also talks about how both at the international level and the domestic level, states should be working on providing particular attention, putting particular attention on the vulnerable populations affected. So, and we have heard about that already in, I know in Northern Ontario, there have been issues with the winter roads not being solid until well into the new year because of warming weather. So, and this is my picture to show solidarity. So you've got President Hollande standing there with Modi, the Prime Minister of India, and a number of African leaders. Okay, so now we turn to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's interesting about these is they are not just for the developing world. They are for all countries and all parts of countries. So, you know, when Canada cannot pretend that the issues are only abroad, they are also issues at home, and they need to be addressed at home. So this is the image that the UN came up with to sort of encapsulate all the different goals, and I'll talk a little bit about them because I think they align up with these ideas that I mentioned earlier about solidarity and equity and sharing of abilities and finance. So first of all, with this notion of global empowerment and sharing, that's a key concept that comes out of the SDGs, as I'll call them. And here I've just listed the ones that I thought are most relevant to the idea of empowering people and sharing expertise and wealth. So they talk about inclusive and equitable quality education, empowering girls and women, availability and sustainable management of water, affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. This is a huge issue with climate change. You know, it's all very well to start telling everyone to stop producing greenhouse gases, but if that's the only way you can heat your home and you know, feed your family, then that's not really much use. So this is where the tension between countries like India and China and the developed West really hit, and that's where you need this technology transfer to provide sources of energy to all people. Goal 9 talks about promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization and fostering innovation, and this is this whole idea of having to move towards a clean, green economy, and not just in the West, but also in the developing world. And then, of course, reducing inequalities within and among countries. Then there's this concept of global cooperation and solidarity. You know, there's a time where solidarity really was only used by the, I guess, the Polish resistance leaders as they were trying to break free from the Iron Curtain. But I think it's gaining a new ground, especially with the Paris COP21. So I'm using that word, notwithstanding. And so then here are the goals that I think really relate to this idea of cooperation and solidarity. So, you know, first of all, you've got this idea that cities are part of the solution, and they have to be inclusive and resilient and sustainable. You have to have sustainable consumption. So this is not just about stopping producing GHGs, but also changing patterns of behavior. And then there needs to be urgent action on climate change. That's a specific goal right there in the SDGs. And they also talk about how do you conserving and sustaining the oceans, so that, you know, as a source of food and all other biodiversity, of course. Goal 15 talks about protecting and restoring the ecosystems, preventing biodiversity loss. And Goal 16 talks about, this is a really important one, and this is where we get back to rule of law, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So I think that one's really relevant to climate change and climate justice. It's the idea that people should have access to justice, and if their rights, human rights, are being violated as a result of governments that do not address climate change, then they should have access to some sort of recourse. And then finally, Goal 17 talks about a global partnership for sustainable development, which is sort of seems to sum it all up. And finally, in the SDGs, my other grouping that I have is the idea of global equality and climate justice together. And I put 16 there again because it's so important. But I've also grouped in here the ideas that ending poverty in all forms, ending hunger, ensuring healthy lives, ensuring inclusive and equitable education again, and achieving gender equality and empowerment, and then providing justice. So there you have, okay? And there we have the last slide, which is conclusions. So with that, I hope that I have given you at least a sense that there's a common thread that runs between the Paris Agreement on climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is this idea of equality, sustainability, and solidarity. We're seeing rule of law evolve to be softer in some ways, but at the same time, a kind of law that can engage more people. It can be more inclusive of all states, developing world and developed world, and inclusive of subnationals such as cities, NGOs, and provinces in the case of Canada. So it's a very interesting development in international law. The SDGs exhort us to share innovation and prosperity, promote global cooperation and solidarity, and address equality and climate change. So this is a very positive message, I think. And this provides guidance to us so that we can help shape global law, policy, and practice effectively to achieve the collective climate change ambition and, in fact, create a more prosperous, just, equitable, and sustainable world. So I've tried to end on a positive note. We've heard some very sad things today, but this, I think, is quite a positive message. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fitzgerald. I'll call to the stage now Dr. Stoett.
I'm going to sit down. No, just leave that positive note up there. It's great. Because I'm going to depress the hell out of you. No, I'm just kidding. I will keep things short. I think that a lot of what was just said I was going to cover, but there are some different avenues I'd like to go down as well. And I think we're also in danger of a very good day turning into a very long day, so I will be precise if I can. I want to thank Anne-Marie for having me here. Anne-Marie, as some of you might know, did study at Concordia University in Montreal, from whence I come. And it's always nice, as I was telling your dean, it's always nice to see people from your university with such exciting careers and successful careers. So, I'd like to talk a bit about international environmental jurisprudence, a little bit about environmental criminal law and new developments therein, and a bit about climate justice. I won't overdo that, as it's been done quite eloquently by my colleague. And then perhaps come down to some specific Canadian priorities that I think we have to cover. First of all, I should be clear, I think it's self-evident to most of us that environmental rights and human rights are inseparable. This is not a dichotomous relationship. In fact, you could argue that most human rights movements have had some sort of environmental connection, depending on how we're defining it, if we define it broadly enough. And I could certainly argue the opposite is true, that every environmental movement that I've seen pretty well has a human rights component. So environmental security, as I might call it more broadly, is inextricably linked with human rights issues. That being said, in terms of jurisprudence, they're still kept fairly separate, right? And there are some reasons why this occurs. So I want to talk about that a bit. Just to go back, a lot of the work that I'm doing recently on environmental security and in particular transnational environmental crime stems from a commission on global security, justice, and governance, of which I was a part. This was put together by the Hague Institute for Global Justice in the Netherlands and the Stimson Center in Washington. And Madeleine Albright was one of our main commissioners. And please check it out if you get the chance on the internet. It was, I think, a very interesting report that we arrived at. And it certainly includes climate and climate justice as a big part of what we need to do to rethink global governance in the new century. But I look at the historical context too. You know, I mean, I often think about that. I think I turned 50 recently, and you start looking backwards a bit more than you're used to. Operation Ranch Hand, this was the United States' deliberate effort to destroy a great deal of mangrove forest in Southeast Asia, occurred in the 1960s, right, when I was born. The Club of Rome came out with its report, and the United Nations had its first major conference on the human environment, it was called, in Stockholm in 1972, 45 years ago. United Auto Workers Conference in 1976 introduces the concept of environmental justice. Right? This is a theme, by the way, that I want to come back to if I do have time. Climate justice, to some extent, is overshadowing what we used to call environmental justice. Is that good or bad? I'm not convinced it's good. Okay, no problem. I thought that voice was going to take over for me. I was relieved. So yeah, but in 1976 was the first time really when that phrase gets used, and it's very connected, as you might know, with class and race and gender and issues like this. In 1978, we had Love Canal, right? I grew up very close to Love Canal, just across the border in Niagara Falls. And this was one of the first cases where an entire neighborhood had to be shut down because of toxic waste, basically. Things should be changing, right? And they are to some extent, but we're far away from where we thought we'd be back then when that happened. Bhopal, 1984. Chernobyl, 1986. Exxon Valdez, 1989. BP Horizon Gulf spill, 2010. And last year, one of the worst environmental calamities in American history took place. And nobody knows what happened. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, some of you might. Okay. So in the Aliso Canyon, Porter Ranch, which is near Los Angeles, right? It's about not even a 2-hour drive away from Los Angeles. We had a 4-month-long gas leak from a methane reservoir. 66 to 97,000 pounds per hour of methane was released. This was a reservoir that was owned by Southern California Gas Company, which is owned by Sempra Energy, by the way. Right? Some of you might be familiar with Sempra Energy. This is the equivalent, basically, of the amount of greenhouse gases that 70,000 cars would release over 20 years. If you drove 70,000 cars every day for 20 years, this is the kind of release that we saw, because methane, as you might know, is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, right? So what's going to happen? This is terrible, right? Why couldn't they have prevented this? Bad technology, what have you. What's happened now is that Southern California Gas has expressed outrage that they've actually been charged because apparently they let the leak go on for 3 days without informing officials. The charge for that is $25,000 a day, right? So we're looking at about $30 billion at least, some estimates run in terms of damages here. Right? That's phenomenal. This came after Paris. So the Americans go and they sign this thing, or sorry, it came during Paris to make it even more embarrassing, right? It happened in October, November. So they go and sign the world-class agreement. In the meantime, they've got this huge calamity taking place at home in California, and they leave it up to the company to fix it. There was a state of emergency declared in the surrounding areas. People had to be evacuated. You all might know what methane smells like, right? I mean, they put stuff in methane and smell it, make it smell a certain way. It's just unbearable, as you can imagine. So we haven't gone too far, really, in terms of avoiding these sort of calamities and disasters. And it's well known, anytime something like this happens over the long term, it's usually the ratepayers that end up paying for it. You know, anyone who's been to California, just mention the word Enron out there, and then run, because, yeah, they're all paying for Enron. So, no, we've had all sorts of multinational environmental agreements, from everything, migratory species, mercury pollution, bamboo conservation, ship recycling, humane trapping standards. I mean, you name it. You name me a topic, I can probably find you a multinational environmental agreement that covers it. But what these agreements don't do is, uniformly, right, is make room for international criminal law, for the prosecution of individual responsibility. Right? That doesn't happen within the context of multilateral environmental agreements. There's no question there's a duty of states not to create or allow significant transboundary environmental harm. This is well recognized. It went back to that conference in Stockholm in 1972 that I mentioned. But that's not the same thing as saying that we actually have a way to prosecute individuals that are involved. I think it's quite clear to say that all major multinational environmental agreements do integrate human rights concerns, even if they don't do it explicitly, and they certainly derive from human rights motivations. I think that's an important distinction, but it's there. So if they're not animated by them, they're certainly, at the very least, infused with them. And this goes from the Convention on Biological Diversity, which of course has a famous Article 8J, right, which deals with the international right of indigenous people to have a say in the use of their local biodiversity. To the United Nations Convention to combat desertification. Right? Its explicit focus, I've found that a much more focused agreement than the UNFCCC ever is. It focuses more explicitly on Africa, but also on one of the impacts, you might argue, of the driver of climate change. And shamefully, I say this, shamefully, Canada pulled out of the UNCCD 2 years ago, citing costs, exorbitant costs. Costs us $300,000 a year to belong to a convention that my African colleagues will tell me is the most important convention out there, more important than the UFCCC. And to make it even worse, of course, you all live in Saskatchewan, well, you don't all live in Saskatchewan, some of you do, close to Alberta. I mean, there are drought-prone regions in Canada itself, right? My first recommendation to our new Prime Minister and his environmental minister, who I'll be speaking with actually in 2 weeks, is to rejoin this convention. It was a real embarrassment that we pulled out, and it's time to make that change for sure. Now, that being said, human rights agreements are less likely to reciprocate. There aren't many human rights agreements, international, where you see explicit mention made of the right to environment, clean environment, much less the right of the environment itself, right, to survive. Okay? And these are two different things, because often you'll see this. You'll see human rights agreements that are pretty clear that, you know, people deserve a right to a good life, etc. But it's very rare that you'll see a human rights agreement that will refer to the right of the environment itself, right, not to be polluted or degraded in some manner. Now, you can argue that's logical, you know, it's fine. But it does take an impact at the level of jurisprudence. Human rights courts, for example, some local courts have been very willing to take on environmental issues. And some courts, especially in Ecuador and a few countries like this, actually have made a big splash in this area. The Inter-American Court did look at a case that was brought before it by the Inuit of Canada against the United States, for example, on climate change. But by and large, human rights courts or tribunals don't like to deal with environmental issues. There's a new journal out, which is called Journal of Human Rights and the Environment. I was very pleased to see this, where these two fields are really coming together. It's published by, I think it's Routledge or Elder Alger, I think, out of UK. So check that out if you're interested. Dinah Shelton has a recent article in it, and she refers to the absence of environmental tribunals. And even though regional human rights tribunals are flourishing, many of them, because of various reasons, are reluctant to engage in environmental issues, including the intergenerational concerns that environmental cases often raise, the unlimited territorial scope of state obligations under environmental law. Human rights law is still very much based on what is the state's responsibility to individuals, whereas environmental law does transcend that quite deliberately. The primacy of non-state actors in environmental law, too, or environmental policy making is another issue. So there's no question that it's happening. The European Convention on Human Rights has been very clear about this. Case history indicates that it has demanded that in order to prove an environmental case of negligence, it has to be linked to the harm of a specific individual, right? And that should be familiar to those of you that are lawyers here. I mean, that's the way courts generally operate, right? The environment itself, despite the Aarhus Convention and other conventions that the EU lives under, doesn't have the right under a court. Now, that might be changing with time, and we hope it is, but there is a Strasbourg Convention on the Protection of the Environment through Criminal Law, which was introduced in 1998, but it's not yet in force. So we have a weak environmental rights structure regarding international criminal law. How to change this? Many people look at the International Criminal Court. There's a very popular movement right now for the Rome Statute to be changed, which would mean to add a fourth element, that another crime against humanity would be ecocide. Some of you might be familiar with this campaign. I've actually spent some time at the ICC, and one of the reasons I did this was I wanted to interview people there and get their sense of it. And they were uniformly, oh my goodness, you got to be kidding me. Please don't give us that responsibility. We can barely keep up with what we're doing now. I don't think the appetite is there. There is a case that can be made that plunder and pillage is a conventional war crime. And we had the trial, for example, of Charles Taylor, former president of Liberia, in a special tribunal specifically for that, because he used illegal timber to supply much of his war machine. Yes, so it does happen, but generally speaking, the cases like, for example, what Volkswagen did when it deliberately lied, right, about its climate emissions strategy or technology, pardon me. There's no way to try people like that internationally at this point. You couldn't bring them to the International Criminal Court. There's no room, there's no time, there's no expertise. We need to get more expertise on this, but nonetheless, it's still a problem. The International Court of Justice, of course, the ICJ, some may argue, is the most obvious place if you're going to have states involved, right? Because as you know, the International Court of Justice cannot deal with individuals; it can only deal with states. And there have been many cases. Hungary versus Slovakia in '97, Argentina versus Uruguay in 2010, herbicide spraying, Ecuador versus Colombia, 2013. That case never really finished. Whaling in the Antarctic. This was a very interesting case where Australia and New Zealand basically took Japan to court over continued whaling practices in the Southern Ocean. I actually attended that trial, and it was fascinating. Australia and New Zealand won handily. And yet the Japanese are going back at it this year. And then there was an advisory opinion on the threat or use of nuclear weapons in '96 that you might recall. And I raise that not just because that is environmental in a sense, but also because what a lot of us would like to see now is the ICJ, pardon me, be asked to give an advisory opinion, especially on climate change, and on whether or not small island states, these are the main proponents of this, do have the right to reparations, which were mentioned before. There is some talk in the Paris Agreement on reparations, I realize that, the Article 8, but as my colleague mentioned, It's just a mechanism that's been, it hasn't even been set up. It's actually basically a promise to set up a mechanism. That's how far we got. And those of us that have been around in politics a while, whenever you see a promise to set something up, you don't take it too seriously until it reaches that next stage, right? So it does make explicit reference to loss and damage, but no mechanism to address it. It's nothing really concrete on liability or compensation. It merely established a process to develop recommendations for approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement, and a clearinghouse for information on insurance and risk transfer. Okay. Paris, I'm glad they came out of there with an agreement, don't get me wrong. And I think the links to the SDGs are stimulating, right? I mean, that's good stuff for the international community to look at, but we can't exaggerate it either, right? I see the optimism has faded. I actually didn't plan it that way, but I'll take advantage of it. So yeah, we would like to see the ICJ actually do that. The International Court of Justice can do an advisory opinion. All it takes is a majority vote in the General Assembly. That's all it takes. A majority of states in the General Assembly to vote, yes, we want to see it. So if it comes to that, it came to it before, by the way, and it failed. So if it comes to that, and let's hope Canada has the right frame of reference at this point. For the most part, human rights remain a backdoor to environmental security issues. So it might be time to revise even the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I know some people are shuddering at that thought. You can't do that. I mean, that's written in stone. Well, things are possible, right? And if environment is as serious as we're going to take it, maybe it's time to do that. 3/4 of states today, according to a recent study, do have environmental protection written into their constitutions. Their federal constitutions. Canada does not. But several provinces do, as you might know, right? Or they're working on it. Yeah? So we'd like to see more, perhaps, at the federal level in Canada's case. But, why not internationally? Why not the Bill of Rights? Why not work it in? I can give you reasons why it's probably not going to happen, but I think that the effort to make it happen should be there. So very quickly, environmental criminal law. I want to talk about that briefly. First of all, transnational environmental crime is huge. Everyone knows this. You all see references to it. You see Obama, Michelle Obama talking about elephants, right, getting slaughtered and so on. And I mean, it's true. We've seen, I could go on at quite some length about this, but I'll spare you the details. But it's absolutely horrendous, what we've seen in terms of the rejuvenation of the ivory trade, the rejuvenation of trade in endangered species, illegal fishing or underreported fishing, illegal forestry. Right? Something like 30 to 40% of all forestry that takes place now, we think, takes place illegally. Something like 30 to 40% of all fishing is done illegally or goes unreported. Right? So these are substantial economic losses, especially when it comes to when we talk about sustainable development. You can't talk about that without addressing this issue. It's a $200 billion a year industry. It involves the mafia and organized crime and bad guys, right? But it also involves poachers who are just trying to feed their families, and it also involves corrupt government officials. It involves corruption, even at the international level. Right? So we have to stop this. And I don't for one second deny that. Right? On the other hand, what I am concerned about is what happens when we stop it to the human rights component of all this. Right? So something that's very interesting that's going on right now is with Interpol. So you've heard of Interpol, the international police. They're not really a police force, right? We all know that. But they do exist to share information, and they're very important. However, they've decided to take on transnational environmental crime as one of their main areas. So they're pushing very big on this right now. They're putting a lot of money into it. When I say they, it's us, because Canada's a member, for example. And one of the leading members there actually is from the Canadian Wildlife Service. Wonderful person, great professional. But still, I'm concerned because in some cases, Interpol is working with some fairly, when we say dubious governments when it comes to human rights, right? And they're reinforcing the judicial systems and the police systems of those areas. Now, it's written right into Interpol's constitution that it does not have the right, it is strictly forbidden, to undertake any intervention or activities of a political, military, religious, or racial character. And you see there's obvious reasons why, right? States want to protect their sovereignty. We don't want Interpol telling states how to set up this judiciary system. However, when it comes to environmental security, there's been this slight opening there, and Interpol's sort of jumped in. Now, I applaud the work Interpol's doing. They've got 5 programs that I think are notable. Predator, these are all operations. They come up with all sorts of cool names. So Operation Predator that's to catch people that are trying to kill and illegally sell big cats, right? Carnivorous, no doubt. Operation Wisdom, that's to try and stop the elephant trade. Elephants are wise, you all know that. Operation Scale, it has to do with fisheries, right? Operation Leaf, right? I shouldn't even have to tell you that one. Illegal forestry, and then there's Operation Eden, which that was the only one that threw me off a bit. That could be about a lot of things, but that's actually about stopping hazardous waste, right? Again, multi-billion-dollar industry, which I personally witnessed when I spent time in Bosnia in terms of the links between organized crime and illegal dumping. So these are all very great, I think, projects, very important projects, and I'm glad to see money being put into them. There's some cooperation here with different NGOs and so on. At the same time, there's also cooperation with the state apparatus that's going to go out in the field and arrest some of these people, that's going to go perhaps into villages, like we saw with Operation Tiger, which was an Indian government operation, right? It was there to conserve tigers, highly endangered. We need to conserve them. At the same time, there were some human rights charges, let me put it that way, of human rights abuses associated with that operation, where villagers were actually forced out of their homeland or out of their villages, and many accused the government of using this as an opportunity to consolidate its political power in the area. So this question was raised earlier, right? Should conservation and climate change adaptation really entail the displacement of people? Should it reinforce what could in many cases be injurious or perhaps even dictatorial governments? Right? As we saw on our presentation this morning on Burma. I still call it Burma, by the way. If our presenter's still here, I don't know, but sorry. But, this is very uncommon. What all these operations establish is a thing called National Environmental Security Task Forces, right? And Interpol doesn't do this on other issues. You know, they're making some inroads there. I plan to study this further and to get a better sense of what influence it's having. I would suggest that, for example, we've got a convention on transnational organized crime at the UN, right? And it's got protocols on drugs. It's got protocols on human trafficking. I'd really like to see a protocol on environmental crime. I think that's important. But that protocol should say something like this. It is imperative that we retain human security, indigenous people's rights, women's rights, and other human rights-based themes in equal standing to anti-transnational environmental crime measures, lest they become convenient excuses for the spread of state power or the forceful economic disenfranchisement or physical dislocation of ethnic and other groups. I'd really like to see some sort of fail-safe there. There are other issues too we don't have time to get into. A lot of technology is being employed now, and some of this is really inventive. For example, we're putting cameras on turkey vultures because they'll fly to carrion, and when they fly to carrion, we'll see people that are illegally hunting them, right? It's ingenious. You know, it's fantastic. Some kid from MIT thought it up or something, but you know, but that's great. You know, but at the same time, as with other questions related to drone technology, it does raise questions about privacy. It's going to raise questions that corporations are not going to like either, right? About private space and so forth. I'd really like to see also there's going to have to be a new focus on several issues regarding climate justice in particular. So I don't have time to get into, I've been informed, into the whole question of whether climate change is overshadowing other things and that's good or bad. I will just say that it's important that we don't lose, I think, the, shall we say now, older concerns about environmental justice, about pollutants that aren't necessarily directly linked to climate. Right? You can link everything to climate. That's the beauty of it, you know, in a sense, right? God knows I do it too. But on the other hand, there are some issues that, you know, yes, they're related to climate, but not directly, you know. So, for example, there's no question that overfishing is related to climate, but it's a crime in and of itself that has to be focused on. Right? And it has human rights implications for the people dependent on that protein. So you see where I'm going with that. It's also important, I think, that that we and this is something that a recent article that I wrote, that we don't start conflating development assistance with climate change adaptation funding, right? And that's something that governments are doing now. So it used to be, look, we're giving 0.2% to overseas development assistance, right? Everyone talks about 0.7 still, whatever, right? Now, because climate change adaptation is a real issue, and many of the projects that are associated with climate change adaptation could be considered development projects, there's going to be this natural inclination by governments to conflate these two things and to say, look, we're getting really up close to 0.7 now. And the previous government did this, right? It actually did this. So I'm hoping that those two things can remain distinct. Same with disaster relief. Right? We want to give disaster relief because there was a hurricane in Haiti. Right? That shouldn't be included as development assistance. That's disaster relief. It's a different thing, right? It also shouldn't be included as climate relief, even though you can argue that climate change is making recovery from the earthquake more difficult, and that there's a development element involved there. So this is this sort of double dipping that I'm suggesting we have to be vigilant that governments don't start engaging in, or that I think that they will. It's not that I distrust governments, of course, but it's always good to be vigilant, right? I trust my children, but I'm quite vigilant about where they go at night. So, just very quickly, I will finish. Canada, I think we can play a key role in a number of issues here that our new government should look at. First of all, we need a clean, clear strategy for complicity guidelines. In other words, we need to tell companies when they are crossing the line between helpful, benevolent investment and they're starting to get into that gray matter of exploitation. And we've called for this for years in the human rights community, I know that, right? But that's no reason to stop. More and more of what we're seeing now in terms of these environmental crimes I'm mentioning, part of the funding for these operations often comes from governments in Canada, often comes from mining corporations and others. Doesn't make us all evil. That's not the point. The point is that many times just the governments are not being clear in their guidelines. You know, but this is where it's gone too far. We've got all the world's banks, this is called the equatorial principles. They tried to get together the world's major private banks and put together a very sound, I think, framework for analysis for this, for environmental impact assessment. Someone mentioned children's impact assessment. I'd love to see that as part of it too. Government needs to work on that and make it clear. Embracing dissent is vital. We talked about C21 today. You know, again, you know, I don't think I need to re-emphasize this, but if you live in a society where NGOs and other groups do not feel free to speak out for whatever reason, they're not living in a free society, and we want to live in a free society. Please rejoin the United Nations Convention to Combat Climate Change, or to combat desertification. That is a no-brainer to me, but also we should rejoin the, we dropped out, as you might know, of the World Tourism Organization. Right? Right? I mean, what the previous government had what I referred to before as premature withdrawal symptom. I get in trouble sometimes for that one, but if it just pulled out too soon. But it would do so, claiming, look, we have to get out of this because we haven't seen success yet. No, you haven't stopped desertification in Africa. By the year 2013, we had not stopped desertification in Africa. Okay, I'll grant you that. Right? I mean, this is not going to stop for many decades, but it's no reason to withdraw from an international institution that's actually making some progress. We should, of course, try to be an ex-member in the Security Council, and if we are, then we should try to push the Security Council to discuss climate. But again, always being wary that when you discuss these things in the highest vaults, if you wish, of power at the United Nations or elsewhere, there will be efforts to co-opt them, right, and use them to their own ends. So you need a strong civil society voice to avoid that from happening. And finally, it would be nice if we could, but I know to talk about opening up the Canadian Constitution is, you know, yeah, I might as well dump water on my head or something, but if we did do it, it would be nice to see something there explicit about the right to the environment as well. I think that it was Marv who mentioned today that health can be viewed as a bellwether of rights, right, or a bellwether of rights. But I would argue that environmental conditions as well. These should be viewed as, you know, an indication of where we are as a society, and therefore it should be in part of our Constitution. And I'll stop. Thank you.